big week for Newcastle. The financial report has been released, stadium news and breaking news on the training ground, kit and sponsorship. How's it, everybody? Welcome back to me, the Fontainer. Lots to get through in this video. Some breaking news regarding the training ground. We'll get onto that in a second. But first, let's talk about Newcastle and their financial results. So it's that time of year where lots of football clubs have released the financial results for the previous calendar year, which is the 24-25 season. And Newcastle have posted record-breaking revenue. The club generated a total income of £335 million in that period, an increase of 5% compared to the previous year, which set a new high in its financial history. The major contributor in that growth was due to commercial income, which rose to £123 million, an impressive 42% increase. And that was largely due to new sponsorship deals with Adidas, for example. On the other hand, broadcasting revenue dropped to £161 million, which reflects a 12% decrease on the previous year, and that's mainly due to not competing in the Champions League during that season. However, during this period, operating costs did rise, and that was increased by 11% to £243 million. One of the big pieces which came out in the financial results was the fact Newcastle have sold the lease to St James's Park to a holding company. Before anybody panics or before you start hearing any rumours in terms of the club have sold the stadium to themselves, they never really owned the stadium anyway. They had a lease to the stadium and they've sold that lease to a subsidiary of PIF called PZ Newco Holdings Limited, which was incorporated in the UK Companies House Register in June 2025. So it just made it into the financial reporting during that period. Now that was sold by PZ Newco Limited, which is the UK registered company which also owns Newcastle United. In effect, Newcastle have sold the lease for St James's Park onto a subsidiary of another company for £173 million. That company, which is owned by Newcastle, is then leasing the stadium back to Newcastle. Might be slightly confusing, but important to remember that this is by far not the first time that this has happened. You may recall Chelsea did something similar by selling 2 car parks, a hotel and a women's team to themselves in the same type of investment structure. Fans of other clubs might say this is loopholes and cheating. To be honest with you, I've been calling for Newcastle to do this for ages. They have to box smart. You have to start thinking outside the box. Chelsea and other clubs have already set precedents by doing this already with absolutely no consequences. I think the club doing something like this is way overdue. Unfortunately, it doesn't give the club much headroom going forward because it accounts for last year and we're in the last year of PSR. It did potentially help us not get a financial fine. It is undetermined at the moment whether or not the club did it to escape any sort of PSR breach in terms of points being docked. And also don't forget all of that £125 million which the club got in for Alexander Isak will be coming in the next annual report, which will be the 25-26 season we're in currently. Doing a bit of research and reading a bit of the news articles, it does appear as if the sale to a subsidiary company also sets up the club more financially in terms of doing either improvements to St James's Park or potentially using that vehicle or subsidiary company as a means of financing a new stadium as well. Whether this means we're more likely to stay at St James's Park or build a new stadium, I still think is undetermined. If anything, I'd say it potentially swings the needle more towards staying at St James's Park and doing some refurbishment on there, particularly because the sale also included some of the land just south of the Gallagate at Strawberry Place as well, but that remains to be seen. The other thing it could mean is that it could be the financial fund vehicle which Newcastle could use, the subsidiary company, to fund the development of a new training ground. And speaking on a training ground, fresh off the press today, Newcastle have eventually announced a deal for a training ground sponsor. That deal is with a company called Knox Hydration. It's actually a South African sports drink company, and it's got no affiliation with Saudi Arabia's PIF. Knox have bought the naming rights to Newcastle's current training ground at Darsley Park in Benton, and that comes into effect from the 1st of July 2026. The deal is worth £6 million a year over 3 years, so £18 million, and Knox will also feature on the training shirt sleeve. Interestingly though, the front of the training kit still doesn't have any sponsorship, which I find slightly confusing. It might be a case where they are basically lining up a potential new sponsorship for a new training ground on the front of the shirt. These are encouraging signs from David Hopkinson. Eventually we started to see a little bit of action. We did hear that his words and his tone seems to have changed a little bit. The mood at Newcastle seems to be a bit more kind of knuckle down, head down, let's get down to business. We've had a 2-week international break where the club have been able to realign themselves. He's come up with some new strategies and new terminology in terms of the club's values and the behaviors and their ambition, etc. These are words which you can find in a CEO training manual. I wouldn't read too much into that, but what I would read into, which is black and white, actual movement forward, is selling the lease of St James's Park training ground sponsor. Absolute free money. Why the club didn't do something like this years ago under Darren Neils, etc. is absolutely beyond me. It makes complete sense. The current training facilities are also receiving a £30 million facelift. David Hopkinson has been adding background staff to Newcastle. The number of people working at Newcastle's training ground has increased significantly since David Hopkinson took over as CEO at the beginning of the season, and I do think the wheels are in motion now, and I'm hoping we get some news soon for the new training ground, which is reportedly going to be in Woolsington near the airport at Newcastle. Let's wrap up the rest of Newcastle's financial results. In terms of player trading, the profits from players' sales dropped significantly to £20 million, which was a £72 million decrease. The club spent £40 million on new signings, whilst generating £29 million from outgoing transfers. We all know, and I said this in my last video, that this current season seems to be a season of transition. I will be doing another video later on in terms of my views of which players I think we should keep and or sell, but it is clear as day that Newcastle are going to have to sell a big name player, whether that's Tonali, Bruno, Gordon, Livramento, Hall. We all have our views on who we think it shouldn't be. You know, the youngsters that have played really well this season, maybe a couple of the other players who maybe show a bit more passion for the club and a bit more heart and desire. I think the most likely outgoings are either Livramento, Hall or Gordon. If you would ask me which of those three I would prefer to sell, perhaps controversially, it would be Gordon. I also think, controversially, we should let Voldemort go. That seems to be a huge topic amongst us fans. There's a big proportion of Voldemort in. Was Eddie Howe playing him in the midfield? Look how well he's performing midweek for Germany. And then there's another proportion of fans which are thinking, lovely guy, really great player, just not the right type of player for Newcastle. I was thinking about this last night about Zlatan when he was at Barca and how he just didn't fit into Pep's mold of playing. And it is really unfortunate. We have a really good player. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He seems to be a good lad as well. He's young, which means he still has the ability to adapt. There is also a question on whether he can or should adapt, because being the size and the height that he is, I find it quite frustrating on how weak he appears to be. You know, I don't think a Peter Crouch type player would ever fit in a Pep Guardiola type team. So does that mean we're wrong for not having Voldemort? And why did we then buy him in the first place? Who signed that off, etc., etc.? My view on that is that he was never our first choice. If we had a director of football, then I would be pointing the fingers massively at the club and partially to Eddie Howe for sanctioning the purchase of the player. But as I said in my previous video, Please don't forget, the club didn't have a director of football. Eddie Howe, Steve Nixon, Andy Howe were put in a position to do things which are not part of their job description. Yes, they got their pants pulled down, overpaying for Visa, probably overpaying for Elanga. I mean, if Elanga was a £20 million player, which, he's not, the perspective on how he's performed this season would be completely different. I think a club record fee for £69 million for a player who's not given us that value yet. It remains to be seen whether or not Eddie Howe can either find a place for him in the team, or whether or not Eddie Howe is going to even be at the helm next season. One thing which was very, very clear when Newcastle's financial results were released this week was that there was a shift of tone from David Hopkinson. In February, in a TalkSport interview, he was very much, Eddie Howe is our man, Eddie's the guy. A lot has happened between then and now. We're obviously out of all the domestic cups. We got hammered in the Champions League. Well, I say we got hammered. It was basically the last 45 minutes in the second leg where we completely just fell apart and Barcelona ran riot. And then a week later, we got spanked embarrassingly by Sunderland. Not so much the result, although the result was damaging. It was more the performance and the attitude and the demeanor of the players. And obviously, someone has to take responsibility for it. And as we know in football, in most cases, it's the manager that fronts up and takes the blame. But as I said, since then, David Hopkinson's tone seems to have changed slightly. Fundamentally, what he said was that let's see what the next 7 games brings, and then we'll take it from there on Eddie Howe. To me, that's brilliant CEO. That's not saying I love you. That's not saying I hate you. That's saying do your job, and then let's take a view on how you've done. Let's not forget what Eddie Howe has done for us in the last 3 years. I do think he's been a victim of his own success. He's being judged on what he's delivered over the last 3 years. And that delivery has been overachievement, saving us in the first season, Champions League qualification twice, winning the club's first silverware in 70 years. And also don't forget, he actually took us to a domestic cup final for the first time in 20 years as well. That often gets forgotten about and struck off his CV just because we went and won it afterwards. People often forget that he actually took us to the final where we lost against Man United. He learned the lessons. He has to take credit for that. But he has to also be judged on the performances and the way and the manner of how the team and the players are performing this season. There's 7 games to go. We've got one really tricky tie against Arsenal. The other 6 games, there's absolutely no reason why they shouldn't be targeting victories. I do think if we win 1, we could win 2 and we can get on a bit of a roll. We've got no more midweek games as an excuse. Eddie Howe has to deliver in the next 7 games. I think personally, if we don't finish in the top half, I think he's struggling. But also don't forget there is a potential huge manager merry-go-round coming this summer. We've got the World Cup in the middle of the summer, which makes things notoriously difficult to buy players. But this season in particular, we have a huge question mark over lots of managers. We have the Man United job up. Does Carrick get the full-time job? Chelsea, Rosinia seems to be on borrowed time. There's huge rumours about this being Pep's last season. Tottenham have already signed a Zerbi, so that's done. Tuchel also signed a contract extension in England, so it looks like that position's gone. But interestingly, Arne Slot's job's also up for scrutiny. If Liverpool don't qualify for the Champions League, expect the spotlight to be shone on him big time. So as I said in the beginning of the video, a big week for Newcastle in the boardroom, not on the pitch. Financial results released, revenues up, stadium lease sold, not the actual stadium itself. New training ground sponsor, 7 games to go. Eddie Howe, job on the line, yes or no? Thanks very much for listening. If you like what you hear, please do give me a like and subscribe. And don't forget,